branch in South Africa.
That makes sense.
Oh yeah, I can see what they mean about the blinding lights.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Amazing.
Do you want to ask everyone to move into the middle?
Hey, can I have everybody's attention? Welcome, we're really excited that you're here, and we actually would love it if you would, instead of congregating over there, please come closer. Join us.
If for real, please do come in. It doesn't mean that you have to stay the whole time. You're still free to leave, and we won't take offense, but it just makes it so much more friendly and conversational if we can get anytime you want.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this discussion today. We're going to be talking about governance models around open source and SaaS products. And we represent sort of 3 different global goods at different points in this journey. And so we're really excited to kind of talk through how our experiences differ and what sort of similarities we're experiencing. A couple of topics that we're going to touch on are considerations when moving from a proprietary code base into an open source code base, cultivating a community of implementing organizations around a global good or an open source software project, staffing models, which work well for both SaaS and open source business models, common issues to avoid when thinking about sustainability of these products. So we'll start with just brief intros from each of our organizations, and then we have a couple questions to guide our discussion, and then we'd love to open it up to questions from you all as well. And so Jen, you can kick us off.
Hi everyone, my name is Jen Antilla, and I am the Director of Community for OpenMRS. And just a quick show of hands, how many of you know or have heard about or used OpenMRS? Yeah, that's what I thought. All right, so we're going to make this short and sweet. OpenMRS is a global good. It is an open source electronic medical record system platform and emerging front end. We are also a global community of talented, dedicated, generous, very generous contributors. And our mission is to improve healthcare delivery, right? We want to improve patient outcomes in resource-constrained settings by coordinating this global community of contributors to build OpenMRS. So this next slide is just maybe a little update. We have come a long way. We are now at almost 7,000 implementations in over 40 countries, serving at least 15.7 million patients. And all of this you're hearing at least, more than, about, because this is all self-reported data from our implementers, and we know that this is actually much higher. So I'm going to pass it over to Taylor to talk about OpenFN, and then we'll dive into the next pieces. Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry. My name is Mary Rashlow. I'm Director of Technology at Dimagi. And Dimagi is a steward of ComCare, which is the digital platform for impactful frontline work everywhere. Our impact is vast. We have more than 130 countries using ComCare with more than 1 million frontline workers supported. ComCare is a no-code platform, and open source has always been like a really core part of Dimagi's identity. We'll talk about the business model a little bit more in detail, but we have both a SaaS and professional services development branches, and that's sort of part of how we sustain the product itself. One thing that has always been really a core part of Dimagi's ethos is open source software, and we believe that as an organization, like making impact, our tools should be fully in control of the users who are implementing those that software. So there are 93 million repos on GitHub, and we're really proud that the ComCare repo was ranked the 54th most valuable repository on GitHub. So we'll talk a lot more about how the business model reflects that and how we sustain that. That's just a brief intro. For Open Function.
Amazing. Hi everyone, Taylor Downs here from Open Function Group. OpenFN is a global good for workflow automation. Have a quick show of hands. I imagine it's far fewer in the room than for OpenMRS, but has anyone heard of OpenFN or used it? Okay, cool. So we do workflow automation, and the idea is basically that even simple solutions in public health involve complex multi-step processes. For a malaria intervention involving bed nets, you might need to find out how many people live in particular locations. You might need to purchase a bunch of bed nets. You might need to get a lot of people to come to a training, and then you might need to lead a great workshop. But A lot of the steps in that process are actually rote. They don't require emotional intelligence or human beings caring for one another. And a lot of organizations working with interventions like this still do huge parts of their service delivery processes with human beings doing things that they don't have to. So OpenFN is basically an automation solution that allows you to identify and scale up the easily automated parts of a public health intervention. Right, it's a fairly complex process, so why is it not already in place in lots and lots of different countries around the world? There's a lot to get right when you're doing workflow automation, and sort of the value proposition that OpenFN provides is allowing folks to focus just on what makes their particular intervention unique. So it's a little bit more long-winded, but thanks for the opportunity to introduce OpenFN. A bunch of you have probably seen the version 1 of our platform. This was a proprietary platform that we built on top of an open core that has been a digital public good for quite some time now. And today we're going to be talking about the transition to a fully open source platform called OpenFN Lightning, and what implications that new fully open source streamlined version of OpenFN has on our business model and the global goods community more broadly. That's OpenFN.
Awesome. Well, I think let's get right into it. The first question was really about your transition from OpenFunction from a SaaS product. You're getting ready to launch Lightning as like fully open source, as you mentioned. Can you talk about the process of like making that change? What motivated it? How did you sustain the existing work while investing in your fully open source platform? And what are you excited about that moving forward?
Great question. So first, OpenFN in the past was, a lot of the revenue that we generated was by selling software licenses. And we actually started with a fully open source product back in 2014. We tried and failed to register a 501c3 charity. We were told that we didn't have a business plan that met the charitable threshold because we were too self-sufficient, and there's some weird stuff related to 501c3s in the US. Anyway, started fully open source, ended up then building a proprietary platform on top of an open core, and grew organically since 2014, selling software licenses, still working exclusively with NGOs and governments and social enterprises. But only in the last couple of years have we started making the shift back to fully open source. And the reason is we found a really, really high willingness to pay for hosting and deployment and security and maintenance services within the LMIC governments and the nonprofit spaces that we serve. But we found a really, really strong aversion to proprietary software. And this isn't for bad reasons. I think this is actually because ultimately what our customers want in LMIC governments and in these larger NGOs is they want freedom. They want to be able to access and use these technologies on their own terms. And we think, anyway, that by providing a fully open source solution, but still providing really high quality software delivery and hosting and upgrades and maintenance and support and all of the things that are actually involved in making software run at scale over 5, 10, 15 years, we think we can sort of provide that whether or not the software itself is closed source. And they're happy because at the end of the day, if we don't do a good enough job in delivery, they're not locked in. They could turn to another delivery provider. So that's sort of a bit of the stuff behind that change. It's realizing high willingness to pay for what makes software valuable, which is that delivery aspect, and a aversion to closed source technologies because they don't want to get locked in to a particular vendor.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jen, I think one thing that the OpenMRS community does really well is welcoming community contributions, whether that be like code or time. But with a team of volunteers, how do you think about prioritization? Like, how does tech debt work get addressed when everyone wants to work on the cool, fun features?
Yeah, so maybe I want to address the first kind of I want to do a little myth busting maybe first. You know, oftentimes we hear OpenMRS is a volunteer community, and I want to really hone in on, well, what the heck do we mean by a volunteer community? The reality is that from the very beginning, and even to today, there have been organizations who have voluntarily committed resources to working on OpenMRS, building OpenMRS. And that's from our back end to our front end, and even supporting our community infrastructure. So when you say volunteer, I think a lot of people think about the single person who comes from, you know, Google Summer of Code or you know, somewhere else out in the world to contribute to OpenMRS. And that's very different from having organizations who are actively implementing OpenMRS in the field contribute to OpenMRS. I have to say that we do have some amazing volunteers. Like our community infrastructure would not be alive today if it was not for one of our volunteers, Cynthia, who works at Atlassian. But what this does mean is that we have to function very differently than, say, a software development company that kind of houses or hosts, you know, a global good or a specific software product. And OpenMRS does have a 501c3 foundation, charitable foundation. There is that entity there that really kind of protects the financial and legal interests of the community, but it also enables us to actually achieve our mission, do that contribution and that coordination piece, which is really essential when you're talking about bringing in contributions from multiple organizations. So now to get back to prioritization, because this really is part of the secret here, or maybe it's not such a secret. One of our values is being driven by real user needs, and OpenMRS organizations implementing OpenMRS on the ground, they know what is needed. They know what's needed, not only the flashy features, but you know, everything leading up to it. They know what the technical debt is. And so when it comes to prioritizing what we're going to do, we really look to see, well, what are OpenMRS implementers prioritizing? What are on their roadmaps? And Grace is nodding here in the audience. We often play this kind of matchmaking role and try to figure out not, can we get all the OpenMRS organizations to come behind this one feature, but can we find 2 or 3, even just 2, that want to work together and build something together within the community? And that is kind of how we end up prioritizing what we're going to support and build in the community.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Mm-hmm.
Is it easy? Like, do you find those matches frequently, or do you feel like you need to really draw them out? Like, are there things that are naturally bubbling up?
There are things that naturally bubble up. I think it has gotten easier over time. So, you know, I remember 4 or 5 years ago, we would routinely have these kind of like stand-ups, and organizations would say what their areas of collaboration, and then it wouldn't go anywhere. But now, you know, we've kind of made some updates to our community governance model that has really kind of unlocked and facilitated that collaboration. And then our changes to our technology have also, on the front end, really unlocked and unblocked collaboration. We're really moving towards a front end framework that allows organizations to share and build together those front end features. So,
Exciting.
yeah.
Did you have a follow-up to that?
Well, I mean, the front-end stuff around almost like a reusable components and libraries.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is super exciting in the new version, the 3.
Yeah, OpenMRS 3.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Cool.
Yeah.
So everybody
Very cool.
should be
Very
checking
cool.
it out right now. May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So ComCare has been, as you say, open source since day one. And you guys have massive scale, massive reach at this point. It's open source top to bottom, and yet you run a SaaS business. That's a big part of the Dimagi offering, is hosting and providing ComCare as a managed product, as a licensed product. Why do people pay for SaaS? Why are they using ComCare?
Great question. So there's essentially two portions to the internal business model. There's the SaaS revenue, so that is software as a service, so folks are paying to immediately have access to CommCare. Today, want to build a new app, can sign up and start using CommCare immediately. There are also a lot of programs that want help building their apps or scaling them or customizing them. And so we also have a professional services branch where we work with partners really closely to build on SaaS. So we use their subscription, like we use their version of their application and we help them build. We train them on building the users on CommCare. But we're seeing an increasing interest in folks hosting their own version of CommCare. This has been happening for more than 5 years in Ethiopia. The team in Ethiopia has been running a national scale instance of CommCare totally independently. So they've pulled down the code on GitHub, they manage their own. The main motives are cost. Oftentimes there's an interest in like utilizing services that are already existing. So also an increasing interest in data sovereignty. A lot of the concerns with SaaS might be like, where is the data being stored? I know there's a lightning talk later today about like more data centers and LMICs. That would be great. But like data sovereignty, knowing where your data is located is a key motive for moving off of that. But I think having that, the recurring revenue from SaaS has enabled us to invest in the core platform, address some of the technical debt. It's not really exciting like updating dependencies or like increasing automation for ease of deployments. But those are things that make the business better for every user of CommCare, whether they are on SaaS or whether they're hosting their own version independently as well.
Yeah, super interesting. And that starts to get at a question of sort of business models in open source, right? And there's clearly a need for core funding, possibly through a 501c3 that just writes free software and designs free software and champions that community. And then there's also potentially a bit of recurring revenue that could perform the same function effectively. There's a SaaS company, Plausible Analytics, that has a really beautiful description. So it's an alternative to Google Analytics. I don't know if you guys who are building DPGs and trying to do analytics, I see a couple smiles and nods. Plausible's, it's completely open source analytics. They're based, I think they say Estonia, rundown of sort of why you might go with your own instance of Plausible Analytics and why you might use a hosted version. It's $9 a month or something like this. But one of the things that they call out right there, which was startling to me, is when you use the hosted service, you're paying providers that aren't working on this code base. And when you use Plausible's, or sorry, when you roll your own, and when you use Plausible service, then you're actually, your subscription to that analytics service or your subscription to CommCare is actively strengthening the product that you are using. And that, to me, gets a little bit into this idea of like, how do we ensure that contributions aren't a one-off thing and that contributions to the community and to the products we're building, whether they're lines of code or financial contributions, are actually shared across the community and don't sort of disappear. I don't know if you have thoughts on this from the CommCare perspective. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I do have several thoughts on this. I think the contributions upstream is something that we don't actually spend a lot of time talking about. And there's actually been a recent study that gives me a lot of hope generally around open source projects overall. And it's done by the To-Do group, and it actually talks about how there are very well-known companies like IBM who are becoming recognized as good open source citizens. And they're being recognized by other companies in the field because they are making contributions upstream to the open source software projects that they use, that their businesses depend on. And so when I think about OpenMRS and all of the organizations who help us achieve our mission by implementing OpenMRS in health facilities, I also start to think about, well, how do we recognize different organizations who are making those upstream contributions back to OpenMRS and really helping make it sustainable because it's in their business interests, it's lowering their risk, and it's making it easier for them to maintain it. They're not shouldering the burden themselves, we're sharing it. But it's also in the global good's best interest. So these are some of the questions that are coming to mind about the power of recognition and the power of reputation.
I want to get back to implementing orgs, but a couple of thoughts on cost first. One sort of misaligned incentive that we see a lot is if we decrease the cost of a SaaS product, we're less incentivized to maintain it long-term. That revenue directly impacts the platform, and our goal of building a platform versus just a product is to have our partners pay the same amount for a better platform in the future. So to continue to reinvest in that platform and build more features on that same platform that everyone can access moving forward. But that can feel like an uncomfortable and like misaligned incentive that if we don't have enough of that money to invest into the core part of the product, then it's not going to be around in 5 years. And so having to repay that on an ongoing basis necessitates having a slightly higher cost up front. But I don't know if you both feel like that is a push and pull sometimes.
Absolutely. And I just last week was talking with another digital public good, another sort of steward of a DPG, and they were talking about how they had a strategic plan that their funder was pushing them toward, which showed a decrease in the SaaS prices every year, like year-on-year decrease in SaaS prices over the next 5 years or 10 years or something like this. And I couldn't help but thinking, maybe the funder had a quite, I don't know, an old school view of like how software actually gets delivered, right? Because I know we've had this conversation a bunch of times within this community that software is very much OpEx rather than CapEx. It's not that you make an investment in $400,000 worth of code and then that piece of software just carries on delivering value in the world for $0. In fact, software is an ongoing cost and you continue investing in it. And the idea that the SaaS price would have to decrease every year because the platform was already built, this was the thing that I think really sort of stuck with me.
Yeah.
No, we should be demanding that the digital public goods and the global goods in this room are getting better every year. We shouldn't be demanding that they slowly atrophy over time. I don't know. That sounds funny to put it that way, but I really do believe that. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, you said old school, and I remember when I started out, there was that mentality. Okay, we're just going to give you this budget for this long, and then you'll build it, and we'll be done. And I think we've actually come a long way from that. I think we all recognize that these global goods do need ongoing funding, ongoing support, and now I think we're really starting to dig into the reality that the core needs to be tended to, right? We can't just focus and put our funding towards the front flashy features. It's really the whole kit and caboodle. And I kind of think the more that we're transparent about what it takes to provide that nice feature to the end user and maintain it, and like the more we're transparent and open about what it actually takes to deliver that final feature, the easier it will be to have conversations about the funding that's required to get there. But if we're not talking about it, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, I think one final thought on the cost part is that we can't monetize addressing technical debt. Like that's never going to be cool. And I think Dimagi is really benefiting from 20 years of core development that has gotten us to this place where we can be investing in the features and we don't have to be constantly worried about like investing in the platform. It's very different for a newer global good that is starting from scratch without that core funding. And that's a challenge that I think we are not facing right now, but I can imagine for another global good that's building out their core platform is a major barrier.
If I can just add too, and sort of going on something Taylor, you said, it's also the fact that technology changes, right? What we built, what OpenMRS built 15 years ago is not the same as where it is today. We've been through that original release, we've been through the original reference application. Now we're going to OpenMRS 3.
That's huge.
And these are huge, and these are happening at somewhat regular intervals. And so I think we need to kind of start working that into how we communicate what we need to sustain our global goods, anticipate kind of the lifespan of the technologies we're using.
One thing that often goes hand in hand with the discussion around cost is security. maintaining a secure platform is like absolutely an expectation working in our sector. But again, that takes like time, investment from developers. How do you think about incorporating security into your business model? Particularly, I think it's different for both of your scenarios, but like when you're working with implementing organizations who might have competing priorities, and then also like when you're moving from a SaaS or proprietary code base to an open source code base in both of your cases.
Sure. Yeah. It's a very important consideration. We have a standing monthly meeting at OpenFN. It's an all-team meeting. The whole staff gets together, minimum 30 minutes, and we talk about what's happened in the last 30 days. What have you heard about? What have you read about? What vulnerabilities might have emerged in our space? OpenFN has this internal mantra, S3. We need to be secure, stable, and then scalable. But actually, I don't care about scalable until we're stable, and I don't care about stable until we're secure. And we work so hard on creating this sort of organizational security posture that is really quite aggressive. It's quite like this is the bread and butter of what we're doing. And one of the things that I get most worried about as we complete this transition to fully open source, and as we start to, I know in Nigeria, we now have a fully open source implementation running on OpenFN microservice. We're in conversations with Ministry of Public Health in Thailand right now to move off of our SaaS to a local open source deployment. One of the things that keeps me up at night most is it doesn't matter how much you invest in the security of the product that you're building and the security posture of the organization that's delivering it. When you go open source, and there are folks implementing OpenMRS in 60, 70 countries, how do you consider and how do you prepare those implementing partners to do so in a secure way? And we just had a wonderful conversation with UNICEF and the Thailand team and Digital Square last week. There's a webinar to check out on security for in-country implementations when working with governments and global goods. The answer for us anyway has been secure by design around the product, and then really, really robust documentation and implementation guidelines and checklists to go through to try to open source some of the hosting and deployment process that we have, right? So I don't know, I'd be curious to hear how do you think about security in OpenMRS deployments when you guys might not be doing any OpenMRS deployments as a core team?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is, we might have our community release, and then once we release it and an implementer customizes it or modifies it, then we can't really assure the security of that once it kind of leaves the community setting. But until that point, at least, we get so many groups coming to us and sharing results of security assessments that they've done. This could be universities, this could be private companies. So these are being brought to our attention, and fortunately we have a small security group that actually cares enough about this to make sure that we've got our I's dotted and our T's crossed. But times we don't talk about it enough. And so it kind of goes back to this, funding issue. There are things that we could do around security that are not trivial. And if we're actually going to address those and address them early on so that implementers don't have to worry about that part of their implementation, then we really need to beef up our security capacity as a community or as global goods, frankly. So in that respect, I do feel like we're talking more about security and what it takes to make global goods secure, and I think that is a step in the right direction. We do need to think about how we're going to cover those costs.
I want to flip it back to you for a second, but just on this idea of shared services, and right? So as a global goods community and as a digital public goods community, we are actually facing a lot of similar challenges. Just really quick on that, we got very lucky in a recent UNICEF project to go through a UNICC security audit, which was fantastic because it really sort of opened up our eyes to all of the potential threat vectors and the surface area in an implementation and in the software itself. And another thing that was fantastic, so UNICC is one option, but then another thing that's great is we worked with Nino Haras, who I believe is fairly new to Digital Square, 15-year white hat hacker, cybersecurity expert who's now part of the global goods team. And I think there's probably some Digital Square people here who could correct me on the long-term strategy, but I think the idea is that, yes, we are facing similar security challenges, and we could provide some almost shared services that we tap into, and some templates and some checklists and some ways of orienting digital public goods and global goods in a very sort of forward-facing, security-first stance. And it's not actually going to be that different across those organizations. So why not make use of those shared services? Why not provide those shared services?
Expertise.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is what community is all about, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so how does Dimagi think about security in country implementations or in your cloud stuff?
Yeah, well, it's awesome to hear like donors or community members like raising these concerns, like because that's really exciting, and being held accountable is, I think, like a really critical part of this. Jed, what you said really resonates about like we can release changes to the open source community, but like they have to adopt them too. So there is this communication element that I think is a really important part. Like we can make all these changes, but if someone branches the code or if someone's running their own instance, it's their obligation to pull down those changes and adhere to our community guidelines around expectations of like bi-weekly deploys, things like that. And so we're thinking about ways to like both cultivate that community of implementers or folks who are working on their own implementations, but also if there are like technical ways that we can connect those on-premise instances to to the Dimagi run version, so that we can like alert folks like, hey, you have an unapplied change, to make sure that's more clear. One thing that we've been able to invest in because of this, like sort of long runway, is like becoming SOC 2 certified. So that's like a security credential that requires a really intensive maintenance process, but increasingly we're seeing our donors and our partners expecting that GDPR compliance or ISO certifications or SOC 2 certifications. So it's great to see those becoming more normalized and more expected, but they do come at a very high cost of having like a team of folks dedicated to running penetration tests or like understanding, maintaining audit logging. And those are like really intensive developer activities that we also need to make sure that are maintained over time, because it's not a one and done thing. It's an annual process that needs to be like consistently invested in.
Yeah, there's definitely not a one and done thing, definitely an ongoing process. There was a question at the Primero annual meeting last week, which was a child protection DPG, not very commonly used in the health space. But somebody asked, how much are we spending every day to protect the data per child? And it was really nice because it almost flipped it around like, ooh, can we get people excited to be spending more every day to protect the data of that child? Don't talk to me about cutting costs on delivery security. Like, that's not appealing to me. Show me that you're investing seriously in delivering a high quality and secure service if you're serious about child protection.
Mm. Do you see implementers demanding this to be part of the roadmap?
A part of implementers demanding a security forward approach as part of the product roadmap.
Yeah, as part of the product roadmap. Do you think it's viewed as a product feature or an expectation of the platform?
Global goods that are sort of built with security in mind, deployed insecurely, are not secure. And so I think you can't, both, really. One of the things that is often quite helpful when talking with potential local deployment partners or governments that want to take OpenFN and run it on their own servers is just to walk them through our checklists. And early in those conversations, you can start to get a sense for what's the DevOps capacity that we're dealing with here, what's the cybersecurity capacity that we're dealing with here. Should we bring somebody else to the table right now? Should we bring somebody independent to come in and talk about, because you're starting to worry, okay, if there's an implementation on local servers, and it doesn't matter how much we've done in terms of preparing the product or the deployment process, if it's just not taken care of, it's a huge risk, it's a huge vulnerability for OpenFN, for the rest of the global goods community, for the rest of the digital public goods community. And I think that the implementers are quite keen to talk through the steps involved in securing a deployment. I'm not hearing implementers sort of clamoring for the security features that are built into the product. I'm hearing more and more funders and sort of ecosystem connectors in the space getting excited about that kind of thing. But I don't know, this may be also, we have a sort of a different perspective on product development because we do it through this open source steering committee, and we actually have just far fewer end users than a tool like OpenFN. So are you getting demand for more security features from end users or from implementers?
Well, maybe not from the end users and the implementers, but definitely through those groups that are doing those assessments periodically. But what I wanted to say with regard to your question, Mary, is we have a publicly available open product roadmap, and on there we actually call out how working on our maintenance, our technical, our security issues is actually helping making implementers' lives easier, making it easier to install and deploy OpenMRS, making it a more trusted global good. And that's kind of where this would fit on our roadmap. Now, it's not like we say we are working on this security vulnerability. We definitely don't want to make that public. But we might have something like security issues, and then and then we have a contact. We say who is working on each one of those items on our roadmap, so that people can go and ask questions, become more involved if they want to.
That's awesome. That transparency is really exciting, and I also love what you said about security vulnerabilities reflecting on us as a community, right? It's not
yeah, absolutely.
Product, but it's to all of our benefits to have secure products that we're all using in this ecosystem. Pivoting over to implementing orgs, I'm curious to kind of talk through how both OpenFunction and OpenMRS engage with other organizations who either are contributing code, who are deploying on behalf of partners. What do engagement models look like for each of your organizations? What do you love to see? What works really well?
Yeah. So we've been experimenting with our engagement model for organizations a little bit. So we've done a great job, I think, engaging individuals, responding to individuals who come to the community and want to get started. But when it comes to organizations, I think we're honing in on a much more intentional approach that really focuses and starts with what is that organization's priorities? What are they trying to achieve? How is that aligned with country needs? And then looking at what's on our roadmap and kind of taking them through, not just our public roadmap, but figuring out how they can get their priorities onto our product roadmap. And a lot of times that's where the matchmaking comes in. And then along with that, spending some time and actually talking about how we work together in a community, right? So part of it is having shared priorities and being committed to working together. But then it's also understanding how we actually do work together. So, with OpenMRS 3, we now have this shared design system. So we kind of make it clear, hey, this is the design system that we're working with. These are the guidelines that we're following. And if you're building something for OpenMRS 3 and you follow these design conventions, it's much more likely to be adopted by the broader community. And so we're spending some time with organizations really kind of making sure that they get to our conventions, where the work is, how to get engaged, and then doing that matchmaking piece.
I love that you're setting those expectations out front with those parameters, because I think being clear about how to get a contribution incorporated into the platform is hard. That's really tough. Yeah. But I think that's really motivating if someone gets a change approved, right? Like if you have something rejected, why am I putting all my time to contributing? But if you make that clear, it's a great reinforcing function.
Well, I think we realized that, like I said at the beginning, we've always had organizations contributing to the community. But I think somewhere along the line we realized, not everybody understands how this happens. How do these organizations do it? So, it's kind of like saying, let's not have a secret recipe for the sauce. Let's make it an open secret for the sauce that anybody can use. And then tell people stories like, how are organizations doing it? How are they making it work? And of course, it goes beyond, working in the community and deciding that you're going to follow our conventions. There are a lot of things organizationally that have to fall in place that are not necessarily in the community's control, that are frankly, either in the organization's control or even in the funder's control. So it's a journey, and it's an exciting journey for any organization, and I love talking with organizations about how they're going to make that journey their own.
Yeah, for OpenFN, we've had far fewer contributors for the core platform, right? Both for literally OpenFN core, the jobs engine, but then also the platform itself, even with Lightning. And we've had some Erlang and Elixir enthusiasts and sort of, individuals who get excited about the repo and find value in it as like a solo shop and want to contribute. That's great, but we haven't, and we don't actually see from like partners, from other organizations, we don't see, or we don't envision a ton of contribution to the core platform. We have a model that is built around this central platform for building these workflows and sort of auditing the history of all of these different executions. You saw 8 million workflow runs a year, sort of which ones succeeded, which ones failed, reprocess them. But then we have adapters, which we do have a little bit more excitement and success working with partners. So, releasing a new version of the OpenMRS adapter or a new version of the ComCare adapter. There we've had a little bit of traction, and we've had success engaging with contributors on the implementation process. So another big thing we're doing right now is trying to open source our implementation process. OpenFN traditionally has had sort of a product-focused team and then a services team go out and do consulting projects to deliver this stuff, and we're trying to take that and open source it. There we've had more contributions from our partner organizations, sort of these other businesses and nonprofits that go out and implement OpenFN. But the core itself, we're going to need to, I don't know, I might be skeptical, but I feel like we're going to need to keep funding the development of the core platform probably within Open Function Group. I don't necessarily see that we're going to ever have a very huge, I don't ever think that like organizationally we'll be able to attract serious development and design capacity for the core. Adapters, yes, that makes perfect sense. Implementation, packaging, yes, the workflow library, shared workflows, great. But I'm worried that I think that core development of OpenFN is probably going to remain delivered by our single organization for quite some time. The exception of enthusiasts and the once-off contribution. Oh, we want this feature. Hey, can we do it here? But I'm a little bit sort of bearish on just how distributed we can get the model for the core, though our whole sort of approach to impact growth over the next 5 years is based on distributing the model around adapters and implementation.
Yeah.
So both sides, but I do think it's important to draw a line around the core and put a question mark next to it, because I'm not convinced that we'll get a lot of organizational level contributions to the core platform. I hope to be proved wrong, and then to learn from you guys in terms of how you manage all those different contributors.
Well, just to give you a little bit of insight, I think one of the biggest things, one of the most significant things we did was really recognize that we're not going to get all the organizations in OpenMRS to agree on what they're going to work on, and we're just too big. This last year we had 15 different organizations contributing to OpenMRS community overall, right?
Wow, that's awesome.
So expecting 15 organizations to come to agreement on what a feature should look like,
Sure.
that's just not realistic. And so I think it's very freeing and liberating to just say, find an organization that wants to work on the same priority that you want to work with. And we will support and help you make that happen.
This is the matchmaker.
The matchmaker, and we call them squads, right? They're like you're passionate about it, you want it, you have a problem, you want to solve it, go do it. And let us know how we can help find other matches or whatever you need. But what I wanted to say is that this also means that if you don't want to work on a front-end feature, you don't have to. We have like organizations who want to work on, our fire first approach. Great, run with it, do that. Another organization wants to work on quality assurance. Fantastic. All of these contributions are incredibly valuable. And I think breaking it down and kind of letting go of the expectation that we're all going to work on the same things in a specific order really helps organizations feel like they have that flexibility.
Yeah.
So with ComCare, how do you guys manage contributions? Where are the partnerships? How does this work?
I think what you said really resonates, that sometimes there's this misnomer between being open source means that the community has to be participating. And I think Dimagi definitely views ourselves as a steward for ComCare. And in preparation for this, I was like running the stats on like, how many PRs?
Just how many have actually
not Dimagi folks?
Yeah.
Really tough to find any. Because I think there's a really high barrier to contributing. And I think there's so much that, like, I just think about the onboarding that developers on my team go through when they're starting to contribute to code, and I don't expect them to be making PRs for like weeks. And so that's a lot to ask of a open source community member. I think where we're thinking about this more is like app builders. So folks who are
configuration, effectively.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
We're like working on the platform, and we're building out like a partnership program for folks who can be very fluent in building very custom apps. They can access like super user permissioning on the platform. They're not coding though. And while we would welcome those contributions, we think that the barrier to entry is very high. And I'm not sure, what you said really resonates, that I think Dimagi will continue to steward the organization or the code base through those security considerations, the scalability, while the fun feature development, maybe it will come externally or be motivated by community impact. But I think we will continue to add those features to the product as the community demands. But I think really similarly, like we expect to be stewards of that core long-term as much as we'd welcome others.
Yeah.
So I think the last question I wanted to kind of go through before we open up to the audience for questions is, if we're gonna have this conversation again in 3 years or 5 years, like what do we want to see changed in this community? Like what is the best case scenario? What would you love to be reflecting on how much we've grown in 5 years? No pressure.
Well, how about I won't describe the entire community in 5 years, but one thing that I would like to see a lot more of is the availability of diverse, high-quality hosting and delivery options, right? That's something that I think would do us all a great service, to make sure that there are not a small handful of organizations that are able to deliver high-quality, secure, stable, scalable software solutions for LMIC governments, but rather to make sure that we as a community have created the conditions to let a lot of different actors get very good at software delivery. And I like the software delivery model because this is not my concept. This is a Kevin Starr Malago thing. Probably not even his quote, but he's looking for greed-proof interventions that still scale. And I like software delivery around open source software because it feels a little bit greed-proof. It feels like we can develop a rich sort of semi-market solution, right?
Yeah.
But it's prevented from ever getting to a point where a single actor is able to turn the screw on some government because they realize that government is now locked in. And so I think one thing I would love to see is a little bit of growth in the software hosting and software delivery side of the global goods community, because I think that's a hugely valuable service for the folks who are implementing these programs, and because I think it's fairly greed-proof. Mm-hmm. I think there's a smaller chance of capture if it's delivery around open source software, and that's legitimately very exciting for me.
Well, I think I have one kind of underlying tried and true thing that I hope doesn't change, and then 2 or 3 wishes, I'll put it that way. One is I reflect on the changes that we've seen over the last several years, and I've realized that our community values of being open and community-driven and addressing real user needs, those continue to stand us in good stead. So I really hope that we'll continue to kind of ground ourselves in our values. And then my 3 wishes really have to do with continuing the growth path that we're doing. So I really hope that by the time we're having this conversation, we're talking not just about, addressing and responding to implementing organizations' needs, but really like the country's needs as a whole. Seeing countries really inform the direction of OpenMRS. And at the same time, I really hope that we're going to see an even more vibrant and robust almost ecosystem of organizations who are becoming recognized good OpenMRS citizens and stewarding a variety of areas, whether it's our core, our front end, our back end, or even things like marketing, events, communications. All of those kinds of contributions are really needed to advance our OpenMRS as a community and as a global good. So.
That's great. I think for ComCare, when I reflect on our most impactful projects, there are some of the projects that pull in the least amount of revenue. And I think that paradigm is difficult, but it necessitates a SaaS business model. And I want to see that continue to grow, because I view this as a rising tide raises all ships. As we have more adoption of SaaS, that allows the whole product to scale. And that when we're all working on one platform, you are getting more value tomorrow for what you're paying today. And so I would love to see continued adoption of SaaS and those communication between implementing organizations or contributors as really valued members of a community that are all benefiting that larger product platform, so that it can continue to be robust, scalable. And I view investment in the platform as a tool that enables local ownership. A country can invest more in their own instance of this product if they are trusting that is scalable, that is secure. And so building that trust in order to hand it over to more diverse ownership, I think is where I'd love to see it go.
Yeah, amazing. Before we go for questions, can I say something about tragedy of the commons?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I warned you that I was going to mention this. Have people heard of the tragedy of the commons? Yeah? Have people approached the fallacy of the tragedy of the commons, or heard about the fallacy of the tragedy of the commons? I'm sure there's someone in here who knows more about this than me, but Tragedy of the Commons was a 1968 paper, and it's now one of the most cited papers about resource management. It was natural resources, and this idea that people left to their own devices would sort of take from the rivers and the oceans and the forests, and they would do so in an unsustainable manner, and it would lead to the collapse of these public goods. It's great for this session. We're here talking about, yeah, exactly. But it's not true. It's like cherry picking. And even in 1968, there was already a lot of research to support the idea that the default for human beings is not to graze the field until everything is gone, or not to cut down the trees until there's no forest left. There's actually a huge number of examples where the tragedy of the commons just doesn't exist. And so I hope we can end this on a sort of more positive note, that in most cases, human beings figure out how to create communities that support sustainable public goods. Our natural instinct is not to just take without contributing back to these public goods. It's a fallacy. Check it out. I'll put a link in Twitter or something to some articles on this. But Tragedy of the Commons, next time somebody says, oh, Tragedy of the Commons, challenge it a little bit, because it's not the default state of humans to take more than their fair share.
Well, on that very positive
note. Okay. Yeah.
No, that's great. So I think from here, we'd love to open it up to other questions from folks about these topics. I'm not sure if we have a microphone. Oh, we do. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Anybody have comments or questions or half-baked ideas? Oh, there's a couple.
Thank you. So I was wondering about the security assessment that you were mentioning, and you mentioned that you share with some, you did, I think, with the implementations, like your checklist that you do.
Yes.
Would it make sense to have like a certified security assessment for each product as part of the offering, like so that to take the burden as much off of the implementers as possible, or others that might be using it, so that they have a trusted way to ensure that their implementation is secure, and that's like part, like your own verified security assessment that you build out. Is that something that would be possible for your communities, or is that something that you're looking towards?
For me, fantastic question. Yes and yes. So both having a standardized sort of, well, checklists specifically, maybe not, because checklists sometimes lead to over-reliance on ticking box, or a fixation on ticking boxes and a failure to actually understand the implications. But yeah, we've developed a checklist for security considerations when implementing OpenFN. I think in the larger community, there's probably still a gap in terms of translating stuff like the application security verification standard and the 10 principles for secure deployment, and all these things that cybersecurity experts are probably upset that I'm butchering the titles of these things, but translating that to something that is slightly more digestible and a good starting place for the global goods. Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fantastic idea. We do it, we could be doing it way better, and a space for improvement, I think. Ooh.
I'm actually of two minds on this one. I think my personal view is that the SaaS offering of CommCare is the most secure. That's like best in class, and that's the one that we can guarantee is audited, is maintained to those standards. We can certainly provide guidance, and we see this a lot in our partners who host their own independent versions of CommCare. Sometimes there are very realistic reasons why they don't want to put like an iris scanner to enter their data center, or like there are very reasonable reasons why they don't want to put a redundant backup outside of their country because they want all the data to stay in country. So some of these things that are what we would say are best practices, we can't enforce, and many instances that folks don't want to take those on their own. So I think I view Demagi's role as like steward of CommCare as sharing what we think are best practices and being very open and transparent about that, but not necessarily mandating or necessitating that folks who use the product use it in the way that we sort of design it for. I don't know, Jen, if you want.
Yeah, I think along those same lines, it'd be more about sharing resources, guidance, best practices, and might put a little bit of a selfish plug and encourage people to go to the EHR implementation session tomorrow, because this is the kind of thing that would possibly be helpful to have in that as a resource, as a collection of implementation resources, including security checklists or what have you.
Yeah. You're asking about the audits, so SOC 2 and the UNICC security audit, both of those, correct me if I'm wrong here about SOC 2, but both of those are audits of the organization that's delivering the software. So the SOC 2 audit for Demagi is very much it's like verifying that Demagi has in place all of these protocols, and it's not necessarily focused on CommCare itself. Something like ASVS is more about the software itself. But yeah, so you couldn't get the full value of it because these audits are often the organization that's hosting or delivering the software.
Other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentations, and I'm very happy to be here. Peter Rick is representing Open Solutions and aspiring to be an implementer within the Caribbean region, familiar with OpenFN, familiar with OpenMRS, and of course CommCare. In my journey, I started off in the public sector, realizing that, we realized that the only way we could have these technologies is through open source technologies, because we could not afford, or the government could not afford, these proprietary systems. Unfortunately, when you go towards open source, there's a lack of the expertise to implement and sustain and maintain these applications within low resource settings like the Caribbean. Now, if you look at a lot of the implementation maps for a lot of these technologies, you will notice that in the Caribbean is an underserved area. I guess we're not as attractive as the larger African continent and some of the Asian countries. So Through my journey, a lot of it was self-taught and trying to figure out how to navigate the open source community, how to get the information required to, implement these things and at least try to get buy-in from the decision makers as to why they need to be looking in that direction. But of course, it's extremely time-consuming and taxing. So what we have tried to do now is develop we created our own company to build resources to serve the Caribbean region. But something that I think would be of great benefit to us, and I see the DHIS2 community doing it, is having these learning platforms and these certifications and so on that, we can help train up these resources, and you can say, okay, yes, this person is qualified to provide, whatever service that they're interested in. And then from there now, having the audits that could come in and audit us as a company to then help give us credence to say that, yes, these guys have certified staff and they are adhering to all of the compliance measures for ensuring that the implementations are secure and so on. So I think that's just something looking at us in the Caribbean, because again, we're a lot of small islands, and when you talk about data sovereignty, that's exactly what happens. So even though we have the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, where persons are free to move between countries, but each of these countries have their own, siloed information. It's not like we have one Caribbean or OECS agreement for, these data platforms. So I think that's something for an organization like us, I think would be helpful. Give as my contribution.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful feedback. One thing that Dimagi has been investing a lot in is our partner program, where we're doing just that, certifying folks as app builders on the ComCare platform, and also as more on the DevOps side, implementing their own on-premise versions. Historically, we've had ComCare Academy, which is sort of like a web-based learn how to do app building on ComCare, but we're increasingly acknowledging just that working with local organizations in target countries is a much more long-term sustainable way to have that knowledge shared within the country. So right now, Dimagi is working with the Ministry of Health in Jamaica to scale up. We deployed a system for COVID, and the government pretty quickly realized that if there were implementers in country, Jamaica MOH would love to have this scale up to the national vaccine system, not just for COVID, but for routine immunizations as well. But that necessitates having those skilled practitioners in country. And so that's something that we are looking to do more of, but it's great to hear that you feel like that is a direction that really will help sustain this in the medium term. I don't know if either of you have thoughts.
Yeah, this is something actually near and dear to my heart. But in an open source community, it almost goes without saying that we're sharing experiences, we're learning from one another. And that can be, that actually by nature is very individual driven, right? You have to ask the questions, you have to find somebody willing to work with you. And so what we've actually been trying to do more recently in the last couple of years is kind of try and make sense of the chaos, right? And kind of define what it would look like, where you could go for, projects to kind of suit where you are in your OpenMRS developer journey or even implementer journey, and make available different sessions, whether they're recordings or a combination of recordings and tutorials and articles and such, and kind of try to link it up too with our OpenMRS stages. For a long time, we've had kind of defined stages that would take somebody from being a complete newbie to being an OpenMRS, senior developer. So we're trying to build those out and build out the resources that would help people go along with them. And then also, for the last 3 years, we've actually kicked off a fellowship program that is actually designed to get people from kind of that, I'm not a newbie anymore, but I want to be a senior. I'm kind of in the middle, to get those mid-level developers up higher. And so we're starting to build out those kind of talent pipeline resources, and hope it will go even further and turn into something like an academy in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
From the OpenFN side, we're not as far along in terms of certifying implementing partners as either of these guys. but we rely on a lot of implementation partners. And there's sort of two ways it could go in my mind. We're exploring both, but I don't know where we'll end up or if it'll be some combination. One thing is obviously building out sort of more traditional certification pathways for both building out project configurations on OpenFN, so creating the workflows, and potentially for training end users or country counterparts on how to audit those workflow solutions. And the second is training around deployment and certification around deployment. But then there's another way we might go, which is, so as Lightning is open source and we're in conversations with a couple of different DPG providers to actually ship their solutions with Lightning. Ship it with Lightning is this idea of like, yeah, if you go to implement DHIS2, why not have a module which is OpenFN Lightning, effectively. So you're almost like sneaking in a workflow engine to these existing solutions. And if that turns out to be a really high impact way of getting OpenFN out there, then I think our training and certification program actually bolts on to DHIS2. Or bolts onto ComCare. If ComCare wants another tab at the top, which is the workflow builder, and it's white labeled and it looks just like ComCare, but it's actually those boxes and arrows you saw on the slideshow, then I think certification on OpenFN is probably developing some like channel partner materials, but making sure that the OpenMRSs or DHIS2s or ComCares of the world are able to certify their own users on how to build workflows, so it could go both ways. I'm not sure which way.
I think we probably have time for one more question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for this insightful conversation. And I wanted to think a little bit more together around the spread of GDPR, right? So it's proliferating everywhere. It's really hard for our technology systems to keep up, right? Even governments are figuring out what does compliance look like. But we also know that governments are far behind technical capabilities, right? And all the risks thereof. And so I'm curious to hear from you all about how we're staying ahead of that, especially with really sensitive healthcare data, how you're thinking about it. And I think how we together as a community can kind of look at the risks, think about the code, think about the things that we're seeing. And I think we've touched on the collective abilities, but we also have variety of platforms and things. So just curious for thoughts there. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can give a start. Good question. So with OpenFN perspective, when folks implement OpenFN, we ask that they first check out sort of how to think about the GDPR from the perspective of a OpenFN implementer. And there's all sorts of funky implications, especially so a lot of the workflows that most of the workflows that people build on OpenFN are specifically those that cut across different sometimes agencies, different systems, right? We're often doing this data integration between these different platforms. So there's all sorts of jurisdiction and liability questions that are specific to, I think, connections between critical systems with sensitive data. I think that it's important that we have really clear sort of how does the GDPR apply in implementation context X, Y, or Z for all of these different global goods. And then I think that regardless of what the technological implementation looks like, you need an approach that is sort of privacy first when you're dealing with any of these implementations. And so part of the security checklist that we've developed on docs.openfn.org, there's another section on preparing for data integration from a privacy focus. And I'm not the privacy expert on the OpenFN team, but we have a 60-page slideshow that I encourage you to check out. And it basically starts with capturing as little information as possible. And when you do put in place those data sharing agreements between two different agencies, that you have a justification for every single piece of information that you're capturing. And it's almost easier from our perspective because, again, the workflows cut across these different systems, so we're often looking at it in terms of, well, do you need attribute X, Y, or Z, almost starting from a really technical level. But I think it's super important that organizations adopt that mindset of capturing as little data as possible, having a really clear justification for why you need that information, why it's actually valuable, why it's critical to delivering this health service, and sort of working out from there.
I think you put that really nicely. I oftentimes feel like people's gut reaction is just to make that a yes or no question. Are you compliant? Yes or no?
Yeah.
And then the second impulse is like, well, I'm just going to take it and implement it. And it's so important to just think critically about what can be applied, what can't be applied, how are you going to approach it. And so I kind of look at it as what kind of guidance can we give? What kind of information do implementers need or developers in our community need in order to go as far as they can?
Yeah, I absolutely sign on to what each of you has said. I think the other component that I would add on is that Dimagi really invests in partnerships in this area. So we often are working with ministries of health who are setting up their community health worker program. Ministries of health are not necessarily experts in data privacy. I am also not an expert in data privacy, but there are organizations that specialize in this. And so we love to equip those ministries of health with RFPs to find someone that can conduct an audit, or a way to work with a managed service provider to host their instance of CommCare on their behalf in their country with the parameters that they set, and we will help them do that. And so we view this as a way to enable local ownership, enable them to meet GDPR compliance or other laws that they have in place or other standards that they are putting in place for their system, because Dimagi is not necessarily the right organization to do that on their behalf, but we want to help them get there. So in addition to what each of you has said about thinking through the process, I think just relying on local ownership and other organizations is a great way to achieve that as well. All right, I think we are at time. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. This is a great discussion. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.